The house was silent, but my skin knew something was wrong. A thin blue light leaked from under my daughter's bedroom door, cutting across the dark hallway like a warning I didn't yet have words for. My bare feet pressed into cold wood, and every instinct I had as a mother told me to turn back, to pretend I hadn't noticed. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt that quiet, stomach-deep sense that something in your own life wasn't right, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because these moments don't look dramatic when they happen, but they change everything. I stood there holding my breath, listening to the hum of the house I had trusted for decades, realizing the danger wasn't outside these walls. It was already living with me, learning my routines, counting on my silence. I didn't know it then, but that glow under the door was the beginning of everything I would lose, and everything I would have to fight to take back. I woke at 3:10 a.m. because the house felt wrong. Not loud, not cold, not broken in any way I could name. Just wrong, the way a room feels when someone has been standing in it too long after they leave, after decades in the same farmhouse outside Cedar Ridge, Iowa. I had learned its quiet language. Floorboards spoke. Walls breathed. That night, the silence pressed back at me, heavy and alert, as if it knew something I did not yet understand. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 64 years old, a widow, and this house has held more of my life than any other place on earth. My husband built it with his hands. I stayed when everything else changed. Familiarity should have felt safe. Instead, my skin prickled. I lay still, listening. No footsteps, no voices, only the hum of the refrigerator and the slow tick of time. My body knew before my mind caught up. Something inside these walls had shifted. I got out of bed for water, moving carefully, as if sound itself might betray me. In the hallway, the darkness thinned. A faint glow crept along the floor from beneath my daughter's bedroom door. It should not have been there. Not at that hour. I stopped, heart tightening, understanding that whatever was wrong. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at that thin line of light as if it might disappear if I waited. Maternal instinct told me to check on her, to make sure she was safe, resting, healing. Fear told me to stay where I was. I moved anyway, slow and careful, every step measured. Her door was unlocked. I eased it open just enough to see inside. She was asleep at her desk, head bent, glasses crooked, breath even. Relief flashed through me and vanished just as quickly when I noticed her phone still glowing beside her hand. I did not touch it. I did not need to. My eyes caught fragments, enough to understand, plans laid out with confidence, timelines, assumptions, a shared certainty that I was unaware, incapable, already fading. The words sat there quietly, yet they struck with force. I felt my heart slow, then pound, as comprehension replaced confusion. It was not an argument or a mistake. It was preparation. Something decided without me. I understood then that I was being managed, not protected. The realization hollowed my chest. I had been reduced to an obstacle, a delay, someone to work around. I stepped back before the floor could betray me. I closed the door without a sound and stood alone in the hallway, my hands trembling. The house felt larger, emptier. I carried the knowledge inward, folding it carefully, knowing nothing would ever feel simple again. Grief had not arrived yet, but something colder settled in its place, waiting for the coming dawn. I went back to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, holding myself together with stillness. Grief did not arrive like I expected. There were no tears, no shaking. It came as weight, pressing down, making every thought slow and heavy. I thought about the years I spent being the steady one, the lunches packed, the birthdays remembered, the quiet sacrifices no one asked for but everyone depended on. After my husband died, I did not fall apart. I stayed upright. I kept the house running. I kept my children believing they were safe. That night, I understood how completely I had trusted them. I had believed love meant loyalty, that care would be returned simply because it had been given. What I felt now was not just betrayal. It was the shock of realizing I had been redefined without my consent. They did not see a mother. They saw an age, a vulnerability, someone to be managed and outpaced. The idea settled deep, repeating itself until it hurt to breathe. I was not grieving the loss of money or control. I was grieving the loss of how I thought I was seen. Morning crept in slowly. Pale light touched the walls while I lay awake, eyes open, replaying the same truth. They had underestimated me, and somewhere beneath the sadness, something restless began to stir. It waited patient, alert, refusing to disappear with the coming day. I waited until the house emptied before I went into my husband's study. That room had not changed since the day he died. His desk stayed aligned. His books remained dusted, untouched, as if order alone could preserve truth. I moved slowly, opening drawers I had cleaned 100 times, tax folders, farm records, insurance papers. Everything looked careful, intentional, too careful. My hands kept searching even when my mind told me to stop. One bookshelf sat slightly away from the wall. I noticed it only because I had dusted it for years without thinking. When I pressed against it, the wood shifted. Behind it was a narrow panel I had never seen. My pulse tightened as I opened it. Inside was a metal box, heavy, deliberate. I set it on the desk and lifted the lid. The first document was a birth certificate, a girl's name I did not recognize. My husband listed as her father. I sat down before my knees gave way. There were deeds to properties I had never heard of. Letters written over decades, folded and refolded, carrying guilt instead of courage. Another life documented quietly while I raised our children believing I knew the man beside me. The final letter was dated days before his death. Regret filled every line. Apologies without solutions. By then, the pattern was clear. My children had not stumbled onto a secret. They had inherited a roadmap. This was never about protecting me. It was about control, about claiming what they believed was already theirs. I closed the box, returned it carefully, and carried the truth with me. Sharper than anger, steadier than fear. It settled into me quietly, changing how I watched every gesture afterward, alert now, no longer willing to mistake familiarity for safety again inside myself. I began watching everything, not in a dramatic way, but quietly, the way you listen harder when a room stops trusting you. Every small habit took on weight. A glance held too long. A phone turned face down. Politeness stretched thin. At dinner, the house felt staged. Movements were careful. Smiles arrived on time. I noticed how often they checked each other before speaking, how the rhythm of the meal felt rehearsed. Ordinary gestures carried instruction instead of warmth. They brought paperwork to the table like a favor, folders arranged neatly, pages already flagged. I understood the shape of it before I understood the details. It was presented as care, as organization, as something sensible I should appreciate. Yet nothing in it asked what I wanted. Everything assumed I would agree. As they explained it in measured tones, I felt time being assigned to me. Deadlines I had not chosen. Decisions already paced out. This was no longer about support. It was about efficiency. I realized then that I was being observed the way people watch something fragile they expect to fail, not consulted, not partnered, managed. I stayed calm. I nodded. Inside, fear sharpened into focus. They were not waiting for consent. They were waiting for absence, for silence, for me to step aside or be moved aside. That understanding settled heavily. The house did not feel like mine anymore. It felt like a place I was being prepared to leave, whether I agreed or not. It carried a quiet certainty that something darker was about to begin soon. The next morning, they brought someone into the house without warning, a man with a practiced calm, carrying a folder and a look meant to reassure. The visit was framed as concern, as care, as something routine. I felt the shift immediately. This was no longer a family matter. It was becoming official. I answered every question clearly. Dates, names, details. My mind was steady, but their faces told a different story. They watched me as if waiting for a mistake, a pause they could stretch into proof. Ordinary forgetfulness was reshaped into decline. Familiar habits were recast as warning signs. By afternoon, my phone was gone. It was described as temporary, protective. My car keys followed, placed out of reach with gentle explanations. I was encouraged to rest, then directed, then confined. The language stayed soft, but the boundaries hardened. I noticed how doors closed more often, how someone was always nearby. The house shrank around me, room by room. I replayed every moment in my head, checking myself, grounding myself, refusing to accept their version of me. That was when the truth cut through the fog. They were not documenting confusion. They were manufacturing it, creating a record where none existed. If I stayed still long enough, they would finish the story for me. Fear sharpened into clarity. This was no longer about property or paperwork. It was about erasing my authority entirely. I lay awake that night, listening to footsteps outside my door, understanding that waiting would cost me everything. By then, the decision was already made. Staying meant disappearing. If I wanted to keep my voice, my freedom, my life, I would have to leave, and I would have to do it without asking permission. I waited until the house settled into its false quiet, every light off, every sound slowed. I moved through my room with care, choosing only what I could carry without noise. My hands shook, not from panic, but from the knowledge that hesitation would cost me time I did not have. The window was my only option. I eased it open and felt the cold night air rush in, sharp and honest. Below, the wooden trellis my husband had built years ago cut a dark shape against the yard. I climbed out slowly, testing each grip, my muscles straining in ways they had not in years. Halfway down, my foot slipped. Pain shot through my leg as I landed hard. Breath knocked from my chest. I stayed still for a moment, listening. No voices, no doors. I pushed myself up and kept moving. I crossed the yard unevenly, every step a calculation. The barn loomed ahead, familiar and solid. Inside, the old truck waited where it always had. The keys were still there. That small mercy nearly broke me. As I drove away, lights flicked on in the house behind me. Shapes moved in the windows. They had noticed. I did not look back. I drove until the road blurred and my hands steadied. I stopped at a small roadside motel just before dawn. The room smelled of soap and old carpet, but it locked from the inside. I sat on the edge of the bed, leg throbbing, heart slowing. For the first time in days, no one was watching. I was not safe yet, but I was free enough to breathe. I used the motel phone because I did not trust my own. The number came from the documents I had photographed, a name I had never spoken aloud. Reaching out felt like stepping onto unstable ground, but hiding had already cost me enough. We met the next morning in a small diner just off the highway. Neutral territory. Daylight. I expected resentment, accusation, maybe greed. Instead, I found a woman carrying her own careful distance, watching me with the same caution I felt. She told me, quietly and without drama, what my children had asked of her. They had approached her with an offer framed as fairness. Help remove me from control of the estate, and she would receive what my husband had promised her. The plan was clean on paper, ruthless in intention. She refused, not because it benefited her to wait, but because she would not erase another woman to correct an old wrong. That truth shifted something fundamental. The person I had been warned about was not my adversary. Sitting there, I understood how completely my children had misjudged both of us. They had assumed isolation made people pliable. They were wrong. For the first time since I left the house, I felt steady. I was no longer running from what I knew. I was moving toward it with clarity and support. The story was bigger than family conflict now. It was about truth, and I was ready to stand in it and take back my voice. I walked into the county courthouse with my back straight and my hands steady. The room was smaller than I expected, plain wood and muted light, but it carried weight. This was where stories stopped being whispered. When it was my turn to speak, I did not raise my voice. I told my story the way it had lived inside me, in sequence, without ornament. I described the late-night discovery, the paperwork framed as care, the slow removal of my choices. Saying it aloud felt less like accusation and more like release. Evidence followed in quiet order. Documents, timelines, medical opinions that confirmed what I already knew about my own mind. Each piece settled into place, forming a pattern that no one could dismiss as misunderstanding. I watched my children from the corner of my vision. I did not feel anger. I felt distance. The truth had moved beyond them and no longer needed my emotion to stand. Authority figures spoke with clarity and restraint. What had been done to me was named for what it was. Abuse does not always bruise the skin. Sometimes it erases a voice and calls it concern. When the judgment came, it was firm and unembellished. Control was returned. Boundaries were set. I was seen as capable, credible, whole. I did not feel victory. I felt something quieter and stronger. Relief. The kind that comes when you no longer have to prove your own reality. I walked out of that building lighter than I had entered, carrying nothing but myself, finally unburdened by lies that were never mine to hold. In that silence, I understood accountability could be firm without cruelty, and truth, once spoken, protects you long after the doors close behind you and reminds you who you are at last now. After the hearing, I stepped back and let events move without my involvement. News reached me in fragments, not because I sought it, but because consequences travel on their own. Deals unraveled, alliances broke, trust evaporated where it had been abused. I chose not to respond to messages or explanations. Silence was not punishment, it was distance. For the first time, I did not feel responsible for managing anyone else's feelings or repairing damage I did not cause. Around me, there was noise, accusations, excuses, attempts to rewrite what had already been named. Inside me, there was quiet, the kind that comes when you stop arguing with reality and let truth stand without defense. I did not celebrate what followed. I did not need to. Justice does not require applause. It requires acceptance. What happened next was not something I delivered. It was something that arrived naturally once the lies lost their power. I focused on breathing, sleeping, and making decisions without fear. That was my resolution. I carried no desire for revenge, only relief. The chapter closed on its own, and in that closure, I felt free enough to imagine what might come next with steady hope and intention. I sold the farmhouse 3 months later, not because I had to, but because I chose to. Every room held echoes of who I had been, a woman who stayed quiet to keep peace. Letting it go felt like closing a door gently, without anger. I moved to a small place near a slow river in Missouri. The windows faced water instead of walls. Mornings arrived softly. I slept through the night without listening for footsteps or bracing for interruption. Daily life became simpler. I drove when I wanted. I planned meals for myself. I made decisions without explaining them to anyone. Safety stopped being a question and became an assumption. The woman my husband had hidden did not become a symbol of betrayal anymore. She became someone walking her own path beside mine. We shared coffee, not secrets. We spoke honestly about loss without asking each other to carry blame that did not belong to us. I did not erase the past. I carried it with care, setting it down when it grew heavy. This life is quieter, smaller, and fully mine. I wake each day knowing where I stand, and that knowledge feels like freedom. It is enough, and I am no longer afraid of my own future. I used to think strength meant enduring quietly, staying, making things work no matter the cost. This experience taught me something different. Strength is listening when your body warns you. It is trusting the unease you cannot explain and acting before silence becomes erasure. Age did not make me weak. It made me observant. It gave me history, pattern, and the courage to choose myself when it mattered. Reclaiming my life did not require permission. It required attention and the willingness to step away from what no longer honored me. If you are listening and something in this story feels familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. Control often wears the mask of care. Doubt dressed as concern can still take everything if you let it. You are allowed to question. You are allowed to pause. You are allowed to leave. Thank you for staying with me through this telling. Sharing it was not easy, but it was honest. If my story helped you name something in your own life, I am grateful. If you feel comfortable, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and whether you have ever had to reclaim your voice. I read every message. Wherever you are, whatever your age, it is not too late to choose yourself and begin again. Your story matters more than you know, and it deserves light.